Start with our speaker. Georgia has a wonderful introduction written up for us. Would you like to start that, Georgia?
Yes, I'm bringing it up now. My computer is thinking, aha. Our esteemed speaker has had a long and respected career as a public servant from the Rogers Park neighborhood, where I first met him as alderman, eventually serving countywide for decades. Starting as an academic at Loyola University as an instructor at Mundelein College in 1979, he now shares his wealth of knowledge as a senior fellow at the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago, helping to train the next generation of policymakers. David Orr entered politics as an independent Democrat, opposed to the official Democratic Party organization. That organization was then controlled by the machine created by the late Richard J. Daley. In February of '79, Orr was elected as alderman from the 49th Ward. He joined with other white independent aldermen from the lakefront and black dissident aldermen from the South and West Side in opposing the corruption and racism problems that we're still fighting today. He introduced many ordinances, including ethics reform. He was reelected in February of '83 and '87 during the Consul War years. Orr backed Harold Washington, one of only 5 white aldermen to do so. After the Washington Coalition won the majority in '86, he was elected to serve as the city's vice mayor. In 1990, the office of county clerk was vacated by, does anybody remember? Stanley Cusper, who ran unsuccessfully for county board president, or then ran for the office and won the Democratic primary handily. He was elected consistently from, I hope I have this right, David, from 1994 to 2018 with little or no opposition. In these 40 years of public service as the executive county officer in charge of elections, he was able to accomplish statewide election reforms, including early voting, vote by mail, teen judges, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, making Illinois the most voter-friendly state by expanding voter rights, which is so important to us in these pandemic times. Please welcome David with your applause or reaction button, and we will now be muted by our member moderator, Dan O'Donnell, for the course of his remarks. Please enter any questions you have during the presentation in the chat box across the bottom of your Zoom screen. David?
Thank you, Georgia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So again, thanks to ARP. I appreciate what you do over the years. A little story about that in a moment. And to Francis and to Dan and to you, Georgia. Just so you know, one of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm trying to retire, but I'm also doing this Good Government Illinois. And there's various information, and there's virtuals like this now and then. Next week, we're going to have 2 very interesting aldermen discussing the city finances, including Scott Wagasback, who's chairman of the finance committee. That could be wild as we try and figure out where in the world the money's going to come from for our dear city. But if you're interested, and I'm just the following things, if you want to be on our email list to get some of these things, the website is www.goodgovernmentillinois.com. Facebook is simply Good Government Illinois. And if you're into Twitter, Good Government Illinois. So,
David, this is Morgan. I'm dropping in the group chat here, or I will drop in if they can enable the chat, an RSVP to join our virtual town hall next Tuesday with Alderman Wagsbach and Martin.
Okay, by the way, thank you. That's Morgan. Morgan, who is kind of the genius behind a lot of our programs for good government. So thank you, Morgan. We're all trying to do these virtual things and pass on good information, a lot of it having to do with how we survive politically and what we do over the next few months, particularly in this election. So in less than 4 months, we are going to choose a new president. The question is, 4 months from now, a few days after the election, will we know? So what I'd like to do is just a few moments, and then we got a lot of questions, but a few moments talk about what are the major threats we're facing. And those are mainly the pandemic, which changes everything in terms of Americans' voting patterns. So we'll talk about that. Voter suppression, which is, in my view, is an all-time high and extremely dangerous and probably more prevalent than many people know. And then just to alert us all that there's going to be massive misinformation campaigns. And part of it, as we've moved in, as you know, for years now, moved into commercials, most of them really nasty, most of them untrue, all across, very little controls over either where the money comes from on those misinformation commercials and or why can they be so dishonest. Anyway, those are all things that will be upsetting to us. Let's start with the pandemic. The single greatest thing, besides worrying about all of our health and the fact that we've lost so many Americans, and due to the total failure of federal leadership, we're going to lose a lot more. So the key to that, though, the pandemic in relationship to the voting, as we know, is that people need options to going in person. Maybe things will be better. In fact, it doesn't look like it when most of the governors are ignoring common sense answers. But let's assume it's somewhat better. The key is we still need an alternative for people to vote, and that's where the mail comes in. And just one little story, I was looking at my own little book here, and at some point, if you want to see this, I know people like George would love it, but it's something that we put out called Voting Rights in Illinois. And so the page that deals with voting by mail, which we introduced quite a while ago, just real quickly, I don't want to take long on it, but I'm going to tell you this because ARP was involved. We've been looking at this since 2002. Other states had this way before 2002, but Illinois was not, frankly, that interested for a lot of reasons. So in 2002, we pushed a piece of legislation with ARP, okay, statewide, to allow those 65 and older. Because sometimes legislatively, you look for incremental ways if you can't get the whole banana. So we did that. It still didn't really go anywhere. It wasn't until after several other tries in 2009 that we made Illinois a state where you could vote by mail without an excuse. The insiders could always use the excuse of being out of town or whatever, but it didn't work well up until then. So the obvious answer to this pandemic problem is voting by mail. And just briefly, Illinois did the right thing recently. They expanded their voting by mail in the following ways, which will help all of us who want to remain safe. They're sending out applications to just about everybody, okay? Now, some states actually do go further. Some states say that once you're registered to vote by mail, like Oregon or Washington, that you automatically get a ballot. Illinois is not quite there yet, but Illinois will be shipping out lots of applications so you can apply way ahead of time. There'll also be a website where you can actually go online and apply, which is what we've been doing in County for some time. It'll also, something that many of us have fought for years, is making, and this is Illinois only, Election Day a holiday. That's terribly important, not only because it's just important that we recognize the value of voting, but if you think of the other key problem for those who don't vote by mail, for whatever reasons, is we will have some precincts open. We just don't know how we'll be able to staff them. In our primary in March and all around the country, just thousands and thousands of election judges, George is one of them, I'm not saying she didn't show up, but thousands of them didn't. They were rightfully too worried about their health. So by making Election Day a holiday, think of this. In the Chicago area alone, far more than 100,000 people who are teachers, administrators, could automatically go to the polls if they wanted to, because they won't be teaching or administering that day. And that's a wonderful thing. And frankly, like the kids, that's why I brought in the teen judges, is they understand technology better. So besides that, Illinois allows you to track your ballot, which is important because people get nervous. Where's my ballot? One of the problems around the country right now, either administratively innocent or flat out suppression, is people not getting their ballots in time and then for not voting. So you can track it if the government agency, whether it's the City of Chicago Board of Elections or county clerk, whatever, has your email, then you can track exactly the status of your mail ballot. So those are all good things. And they're also, I guess I left out one other. Also, there will be secure places to drop off ballots. Okay, remember you see in the news sometimes, like when Oregon is doing it or Washington, you see the cars all pulling up and they hand their ballot. There's a guard there and they put it right in the post office box. So there will be some of those sites. They've already designated, and for example, in Chicago, the 51 early voting sites as places to drop off the ballot, but I'm not sure yet whether that'll be outside, because it's inconvenient if you're not able to walk and you're driving to the polling place. Where do you park to drop off a ballot? So those things are all to be figured out. So the challenges, because so many things involved here, the challenges and where it brings in voter suppression is that just administratively alone, nonpartisan, there are many problems when one goes from maybe 10%, 15%, 30% voting by mail to a much larger number. Okay, it's a whole different election. And most people aren't prepared for that. And remember, most county clerks, unlike me that had 270 staff and a lot of talented people, most of them are gone, unfortunately. But most of the counties in this country are places where there might be 15 or 20,000 voters, so much smaller. They might have a total of 3 staff or 4, including the clerk, that do elections and vital records and other things. So they do not have a great deal of staff. So there's been movements now for months and actually years to try and get the federal government to pony up some money. So when you think about the mail, Philadelphia went in the primary in 2016, which was maybe 2,000 votes by mail, to 2020 in their primary, 225,000 votes by mail. So when you do that, you need people to open all that mail. You need to have these high-speed printers. You need to be high-speed sorters. In a place like Cook County, we have hundreds of different ballot styles. So we got to make sure Francis's ballot goes to the right place or won't be counted right. And George is going to a different, and Dan goes to a different one, depending on where you live and your particular ballot style. If you do all that by hand, you're going to be counting those ballots for weeks. Okay, so we do need to help those places. Okay, so those are just understandable administrative problems. Then you add the voter suppression. The Trump White House constantly saying it's fraud and so forth, even though that's the way he votes. But it gets much dicier than that. For example, one of the good news is 3 of the swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, all do allow voting by mail without an excuse, okay, which is good. The problem is, like I said earlier, you have to be able to prepare all the ballots. You can't count ballots. We can't in Illinois either. We can't turn that switch until 7 o'clock Tuesday night. And then tens of thousands will immediately start entering the system, and we'll start counting them. But we would be days behind in that count if we weren't allowed to prepare them ahead of time, to open these hundreds of thousands of ballots, to sort them, like I said, with a high-speed sorter, to check things with signature, all sorts of things, which, by the way, we do. At least when I was there, we did it with election judges, Republicans and Democrats watching, a lot of protections built in. So other states understand that. For example, in Michigan, they've been trying to pass a law, but the Republicans, in this case, won't let them. Okay, the law would say they could do things like Illinois and other states, we can prepare the ballots, Because what I think the president is trying to do is saying voted by mail is all fraudulent, okay? And yet those same Republicans supporting him won't make it easier, okay, either by providing the federal money that's sitting there to pay for some of this stuff because of mail, or to allow states to do the logical thing, which is prepare everything. You still don't count them till the polls close, but you prepare all of it. It's different when it's just a small number of ballots. But think of a state like Michigan that might have 200 or 300, well, no, it could be more than that. Let's say a minimum 300,000, okay? And if they have to count all those at the last minute, there may be a late count if it's a close election, and you can see how, and not just in this case, the president screaming fraud, whatever, but the media likes immediate results. And if it's really close and we're all waiting for Michigan or Wisconsin to finish counting the mail ballots, and it's 5, 6, 8 days later, you can see the chaos that might follow. We still might get a perfectly legitimate count, but you can imagine the shenanigans that go on if there's that delay. So one of the most important things is to make expectations real. And what I would say to our colleagues, those of you that like to write letters or make calls, particularly to Republican legislators in Wisconsin and Michigan, is to go ahead, allow that to happen. It's safe, it's being done in other places, there's no threat, but it's the only way we'll be able to count a significant increase in mail balloting. So, I mean, there's a lot of things like that I could talk about. I want to kind of end it soon so we can talk about other things. So remember, part of what we're doing is always looking for volunteers. Besides the pandemic problem, there's some fairly massive voter suppression efforts around the country. And without going into that in detail, unless there are questions, keep in mind that a lot of places, hundreds of thousands of people have been purged. And, purging is legit. You pass away, you move to another state, well, you should have your name taken off the list. But there's a lot of shenanigans going on right now, particularly in Wisconsin, and so far they've gotten away with it because the Supreme Court has gotten so bad. Basically saying if you haven't voted in the last 2 elections, we're going to throw you off. Now that's improper, it shouldn't happen, but it is happening. So when we're looking for volunteers, we're looking for people, number one, that will help people register or re-register, okay? Or will help people vote by mail and explain what has to be done. In many cases, it's fairly simple, but to get them an early start, okay? That way, the sooner you get in, it's easier that you get your ballot early and you get your ballot in, okay? That would make you safe. One other worry, I'll just mention it on this whole front, because we're looking for massive increases in voting by mail because people don't want to catch the virus going to vote. So the other issue is the post office. And it's important that people understand, like so many things, the post office is not just a bunch of slaggards, like some would like to say, but there were particular restrictions put on the post office, which makes it really hard for them to function like every other quasi-public private corporation in the country. You may not know this, but if you don't, this is the problem with the post office. Okay, number one, they're forced to serve, which is good, all those local areas. It's much more expensive to serve those little local areas in the mountains of Montana than if you could just say, like many private corporations, oh, I'm going to ignore that market. I'm going to cut the train that goes there. I'm going to cut this. I only want to serve the popular, more financially successful. But even worse than that, a 2006 law passed mostly by Republicans, said that they had to have all health care paid up and pensions paid up for years into the future. Now, nobody else has to do that. So if you're the post office and you only have so much revenue, and an amazing amount of your revenue has to go to those requirements I just mentioned, there's not a lot left. Now, the Democrats, with some Republican support, were able to come up with billions to help, but it's probably not going to be enough, and we don't know when they'll run out. And so that's another problem. If the White House and others play these games and there's no money, how do we get all these mail-in ballots mailed, okay? And I don't want to overdo the challenges we have, because there's a lot of good people working on them, and people do find a way around these things. But let me just kind of ended it there. There's a lot of other suppression. There's a lot of good things going on, but citizen help could really be useful. Illinois is in pretty good shape for the reasons I mentioned. But to the extent that you're involved politically, one way or the other, there's things you can do to help other states. So let me get into some of the questions. Are you asking them, Francis, or how are we doing this?
We had some beginning questions for you. Do you have any comments on the fair tax initiative?
Absolutely. I have comments on a lot of things. The fair tax,
We love comments.
I have opinions over the years. You know, as we get older, we have opinions, I guess. The fair tax, in my mind, is very important. First of all, most states, I think 43 states do tax income, which makes sense. A few don't, but secondly, to have what they call a progressive or fair income tax, where you pay more if you make more, is just totally logical. And many states have it. And it's going to be very ugly in the next few months. The ads have already started. And unfortunately, like I say, some of you, I see no truth whatsoever in them. Let me tell you what I know of the facts so far. Okay. The facts right now for the fair tax, which we'll vote on in November, it'll need 50% of those who vote on the referendum itself. A lot of people won't even vote on that, okay? Some people will only vote on that, depending on their political persuasion. So 50% of those who vote on the referendum, or 60% of voters overall, because more people will vote overall than will vote on that one particular item. It's kind of like the judges. Usually 60 to 70% of voters who vote on the judges, but not everybody does. But here's the key. The pro side simply says, this is a way that we can raise significant revenue, which we need. And by the way, in my view, the most important reason they need that is what is causing so much unfairness, institutional racism, violence and everything, is the state does not pay its fair share for schools. It doesn't matter much for Wilmette, Highland Park, even Evanston. It matters enormously for Chicago, who doesn't have the revenue of an Evanston, a Skokie, et cetera. Okay, that is probably the most dangerous thing about Illinois not paying its fair share. But where does the money come from? Okay, if we're talking about the extraordinary problems we have with violence and helping people who face discrimination every day get out of it, let's make the schools better. So, so the way they do this, quote, fair tax is 97% of Illinoisans would either stay the same or go down, okay? Only 3% of Illinois taxpayers would have to pay more. And it's not even that much. It may sound like it, but obviously the goal is to tax those who can afford it more. So the numbers are, just real quickly, if you make $250,000 to $500,000, your tax rate would be higher. It would be at 7.75%. I think that's what it would be. Okay, you know, still not that high. Remember when some of us were old enough to remember the Eisenhower years? You know, the late 1950s. This was not local, but people were paying 70, 80%. Okay, and our country was frankly doing a lot better, at least in terms of people moving ahead after World War II and making some progress. Those making 100,000 to 250,000 would now pay the same, which right now is at 4.95%. Okay, that's the rate that we pay right now. So that includes a lot of people, and those who are making between 500,000 and $1 million would actually pay 7.85, slightly up from 7.75. And those over $1 million would pay 7.99%. So it's still, for the very well off, they only go up to 7.99 at the most, over $1 million, okay? Now for 100,000 or less, which is most people, yours actually would go down. So that's why the supporters can actually say many people, again, would pay the same or less. Now, it goes down to 4.9% from 4.95%. So it doesn't go down a lot, but that is the pro argument. Like I say, the only anti-argument, and the anti-argument, the lies are simply, it's like if you look at the ads that are already out, it's going to hit working class people who are suffering from the virus. Well, it's working class people are suffering from the virus, but the change in Illinois law would not hurt them. It would help them, not only because they pay a little bit less, but more importantly, the state would increase their revenue. Now, if that revenue is spent properly, like I said, for schools or all the other programs, no offense to our former governor, Mr. Rauner, so many things were cut. And in my view, at least my personal view, is those cuts largely hurt Black and brown more communities than others, in some cases senior communities. Anyway, so that is the plan. By doing it this way with 97%, if the truth is out there, you'd think voters would support it. But as you see, voters often are nervous about any tax, and the argument of those who are against it, at least the quote honest argument, would be, oh, well, true, but what'll they do next, right? If they can do this, it's 97% now, well, then how about next year? Now they'll knock it down to 90% or blah, blah, blah. So one is provable, one isn't, but again, it's certainly a fair argument. So that's the fair tax. From just my point of view, knowing that, yes, I'm totally for spending money more wisely. You know, I fought the machine all my life. It's still there to a certain degree. There's enormous unfairness sometimes in governments. I happen to think we have a very good president. We have a very good mayor. They're trying to change those things. But the fact is, we can all point to mismanagement or waste. But all the experts, the nonpartisan experts, argue we also have a revenue problem. And if we have a revenue problem to deal with the pensions, even though there should be changes there and so forth, but if we have a revenue problem, this is the fairest of all ways I can think of to do it. Because raising people's property taxes, that's not fair. Sales taxes hits the low and moderate income people the hardest. Okay, what else, Francis?
Can you tell us, the fair tax question will be on the November ballot.
Yes.
Is that a binding or advisory?
Oh, this is the whole ball game. This is not advisory. This is binding.
What happens?
Pardon?
What happens with the result of the vote?
Well, if it passes starting January 1st, 2021, okay, this will go into effect. So you can see there will be no revenue. If it passes, there'll be no revenue right away, okay? But as people prepare their future taxes, they will have to pay it. So the good news, if you believe this is a good way to go, is that it'll say to the bond agencies and also others, wait a second, Illinois is addressing its revenue problem. You know, Chicago in the future may benefit from a casino, since tens of thousands of Chicagoans spend their money in casinos outside of Chicago. Even if you're anti-casino, we'd like to get more of the revenue. So the bottom line, if it passes, this will gradually be implemented in 2021. If it fails, our budget problems are even worse than they were before the pandemic. And at this moment, one of the key variables, by the way, on that whole issue is, will the federal government do, as at least the Democrats and some Republicans are trying to do on the next, you know, CARES Act, whatever, is provide relief to many of the cities and states. And it's not just Democratic states like Chicago, it's Republican states that are getting murdered literally by the costs of the pandemic that are not on their budgets. Remember, they're getting murdered by the fact of loss of revenue, okay? The sales taxes are way down. All sorts of things are gonna be way down. And so if in fact it doesn't pass and Illinois has to face this pandemic without understandable relief from the federal government. And just one point on that, and I'm not sure where your views are, but no country in the world, except Russia and Brazil, have handled the pandemic so ridiculous. That's even too strong of a word. An absolute total failure. And many of you are older like me, not that I remember World War II, but this whole notion that we're going to fight a war, a deadly war, but it's up to you in the States. It's like if I was Trump and this was a world war, okay, well, Vermont, I want you to take on this country. And you, Texas, you go fight over there and blah. You know, absolutely insane. We have a national government for this reason. We have the ability to raise funds for this reason. And never can I'm aware of in a crisis like this has the federal government basically say, well, don't look at me. And then if the states do something good, they try and take credit. And when the states, like many of the southern states right now, doing terrible stuff and we're paying for it, oh, well, that's them. Next.
What is your opinion about the state of our voting equipment? And this is a two-prong. Give us the outlook for digital voting.
Well, first, let's say by digital voting, are you talking about voting from your home on your computer?
Yes.
That's not going to happen for some time. Again, there's technology to do it. It's kind of like we have technology to send people to the moon, okay? And people say, well, if we can send people to the moon, why can't we run elections properly? Well, when we send people to the moon, we have a totally controlled atmosphere. We have scientists in charge, not politicians, and everything has variables that are controlled. When you go to vote, as those who've been judges know, these are humans. Humans make mistakes. The election equipment, frankly, I think in Illinois is pretty good, okay? That is not our problem right now. There may be local clerks that don't prepare like they should, don't train people the way they should, like happened here. But no, the equipment is partly okay because remember, everything we have in Illinois has what we call a voter-fiable paper trail, okay? And while I think Chicago did very well with electronic equipment over the years for a lot of reasons. With the electronic, we always had a choice, but the electronic equipment allowed people with disabilities to vote where they couldn't before. It allowed everyone to see a screen. It allowed us to deal with all this complicated things like an early voting to allow people, you can go pick up your daughter who lives in a different town and you can vote early with her because of technology. So there's amazing things there, but it's changed. You may not see the changes. We got new equipment before I left office, which is being used by Suburban Cook and Chicago. Most of the other states, have traditional equipment where you're kind of handed a ballot, you fill it out by paper, and you put it in. Okay, so there can be other challenges, but the equipment itself is pretty good. So,
why don't politicians make use of programs such as Zoom to get to learn what the taxpayers and citizens want to see happening?
I'm sorry, why don't
the elected people use tools like Zoom to learn what taxpayers and citizens want to see happening?
Well, I think more and more people, frankly, will use Zoom just because the crisis is, kind of a whole other way of doing things. The problem isn't so much the politicians don't know what people want. There's all sorts of polls, and the richer the politicians and the political parties, they do polling all the time, and they do small groups. That's not the problem. The problem is our system in this country is fundamentally flawed. It is not democratic. Okay, now democratic in 1776 or 1780 or 1790, even though we didn't let women vote and African Americans and people without property, for that era, it was different, okay? But just think from when I say we have an incredible structural problem in this country, our most important elected body is the US Senate. And whatever we needed back when it was totally agrarian and we had this compromise between big states and small states, if you know your American history. But the US Senate is totally flawed because it's not representative by people. And so you know this. So California with 38 million people has 2 senators, and Montana with maybe a little over 1 million has 2 senators. Okay, so number one. Secondly, gerrymandering, and our Supreme Court has sold us out in so many ways. They refused to deal with gerrymandering. They struck down good laws which helped to suppress the voter suppression. I cannot say enough bad about the Supreme Court at the moment. 53, and maybe it's 56 million Americans right now live in states where the losing party statewide has far more elected representatives. Okay, Texas is a good example. Wisconsin, okay. Wisconsin, the Democrat won recently for governor, but they got almost a 2-to-1 margin of state legislators, okay. So this is a travesty. And when people will do things, as we see in voter suppression, we're going to do things. We do not care about justice. We don't care about traditional laws. We want one thing. We want to win the election, okay? And that's where we're at. Now, again, you may see me as fairly partisan, but the bottom line is I would say the same things about the machine a few years ago. Remember, part of the reason I think I know something about these things is I watched the machine. The machine was a voter suppressor, okay? They did all sorts of things to suppress the vote they didn't want. You know, they may want African Americans to vote in a general election by help their candidate, but in a primary, which Richard Daley running against Jane Byrne, they would do all sorts of things to try and discourage the black vote. And I could go on and on about the structural unfairness of the system, and then you add the filibuster. And, you know, some people might wonder, wait a second, I thought when Obama won, you know, we had 52, maybe 53, 54 Democrats. Wow, I thought 50 was a majority, okay? Or at least 50 plus 1. And then lose, all in the filibuster. So filibuster, which was an historical thing, which some might argue is a good idea in very selective cases, became the way in which we governed. So it didn't matter that one party had a majority, a clear majority, they still couldn't pass things because 40 people could stop pretty much everything, okay? These are all extraordinarily dangerous flaws in our system, okay? And I think it helps to explain why we're up against so much, okay? And, you know, Electoral College, all these, if you study the reason behind them, is powerful people know how to do things. I've been following this voter suppression, and it really came on big after Bush lost the 2000 election, but the court gave it to him. Okay, in my humble opinion, he didn't have as many votes. Florida cheated in so many ways, but the Supreme Court stepped in and said, we're going to make a ruling, we're going to make him president, but you can never use this ruling on any other. No, the whole idea of Supreme Courts, as you know, is to set tradition, so to speak, set precedent, okay? But they said, no, in this case, you can't do anything except elect the guy we want, but it will not have any other effect. Again, not everybody, it's not all Republicans. There's some good Republicans that voted, supported mail voting. Things have changed in this country. It's important to understand that. And those who are the Republicans know that the Republican Party is no longer conservative. Conservative stands for a number of things, which many of you may respect. The Republican Party today is led by right-wing people who have a very different view of how we should govern. Okay, and that's a longer story. I think Governor Round was one of those. Some of these people believe very dearly in these views, but they're very different, and they're not supportive of democratic values.
How can we help other states with their voting?
Well, the key would be is, for one, if you have $5 or more, help these legal groups that are fighting in court all the time. And some of them have been great. You know, that civil rights group Under the Law, whatever, the League of Women Voters, all sorts of our talented folks, ACLU, they're fighting these battles in court, which is really important. Secondly, if you can volunteer. I said before specifically, like right now, I'd be trying to see if you have any friends, or if you're a Republican, I'd be trying to push those folks in Michigan, come on, pass the law. I don't want to die, but I want to vote. And if we want these votes to work right, we've got to be able to prepare the ballots before election day. If I got 300,000 ballots sitting there on election day, and I can't even open them, start sorting them, checking the signature, all those things we do in Illinois. Okay, very important to push that in the states that won't let them for partisan reasons. And then I'd be looking to help those call people like in Wisconsin, when hundreds of thousands of people were kicked off the rolls. They may not even know it. I would join those groups that are trying to contact those people, explain it's not that hard to re-register. It's not like Texas, where in Texas, because of the voter ID, there's actually people who have to travel 170 miles. I know it's not everybody, 170 miles to get a new ID, and they think it's fair. That's how big Texas is, and to find an office open sometimes. But you could help out with people who need to re-register because they were taken off, I think unfairly, but the courts upheld it. And you can be encouraging everybody, both here and in other states, wherever you want, whatever your political views are, to vote by mail and help them to do that. Now the states vary, but most of the states now are really trying to provide the information early, like I said, sending out applications, okay? And for here in Illinois, remember, you can apply for your absentee ballot application or your mail ballot. We used to call it absentee, I try and now use the word mail. Apply for your mail ballot online. So if that's not too confusing for people, it's a great way to do it. It also allows, what I mentioned earlier, you can track it. And so, it's September 1st. I haven't signed my ballot yet. Well, it's too early, but here's what's going on. So I think all those things can be very helpful to groups that really want to make sure people vote, regardless of their party.
I'm going to be sending around an email to all of our membership about various links to help with the voting.
Good.
Not only in Illinois, but like you say, Wisconsin and neighboring states. So if you have links that you would like to include, please send them to me.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of groups out there that are encouraging people to do that. Actually, there's a lot of people doing stuff in Iowa now too.
Mm-hmm.
It's partly because of the closeness. Sometimes if it's a really competitive state, we don't see Illinois in the same way. There'll be some competitive congressional races. But presidentially, some people are going to those other so-called swing states.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to get that out to our membership.
Good.
Does anyone else have a last-minute question before we go? You can unmute yourself and talk.
Yes,
Go ahead,
I had
Gina.
one. The state of Illinois has over 1,500
Could you say
additional.
who you are? Excuse me. Could you say your name first?
Joanne Becker.
Oh, thank you, Joanne.
The state of Illinois has over 1,500 additional overlapping redundant government organizations that cost the taxpayers lots of money. Many, many other states have consolidated, but Illinois does not talk about that. And it's costing us more money, and the pensions aren't being funded because the money is going for like 12 mosquito abatement district commissioners in Cook County with staff. There's many, many things that could be done.
Well, it's both a question and it's an answer. It's a very good answer. Yeah, sometimes, I mean, even think of county government. Okay, I'm not sure. I think Illinois became a state around 1837. And even before that, they had to divide up states. So they had these counties. So you had all these counties with no people in them because most people were just beginning to move into the smaller cities and towns. So sometimes things get there and then people get elected and they find ways to make themselves important. There is a movement around this state, okay, to try and do something about that. There's been some pretty good movements. Most of you don't know this, but actually Richard M. Daley and I did a consolidation most people don't know about, and we weren't the best of friends. But for a long time, there was a separate place for people to get birth and death records down in the basement of what was the courts building there, the Daily, what we call now the Daily Center. And they had a lot of trouble. They spent a lot of money, and it didn't make sense because most people got their directions from us in the county clerk's office. Anyway, we consolidated that too. The city totally got out of it. It made sense. One-stop shopping. I think they had 25 to 27 staff doing something, which we only needed 3. Just an example, the county made a good move fairly recently in forcing the joining of the county recorder's office and the county clerk's office. Now, my only concern is you can save a lot of money if you do it right, or if you play the old political games and just reward your friends, you can not save any money. The voters passed that. Took a long time, unfortunately, and 2 tries. The voters passed it. It goes into effect with the passage of the next county budget for the 2020 election year. Most, by the way, just so we understand, most of those, I mean, we have a lot here in Cook, but a great amount of those districts you're talking about, really small ones, actually in central and southern Illinois. So it's not all us with our mosquito abatement districts. And you've seen Evanston and Oak Park both did away with township government. There's a lot we could do. And it's not that, I don't want to condemn all the people. There's people that do some work, okay? But we just can't afford it because we've seen historically, if there's limited money, it really goes to those who have more influence. And so if we want the limited money to help maybe dealing with the violence crisis we have in Chicago or the schools crisis and so forth, you're absolutely right. So there's a lots more we could do. And some are get really tricky, okay? And this one tick off a lot of my friends, but the Water Reclamation District, okay, I don't know what their budget is, 6 billion or more, something like that. And there's some very good people on it now. Some really good people have been elected over the last few years. It used to be a total patronage haven. And they've done some good things. But why couldn't our county commissioners? We have 17 county commissioners. You know, in a place like LA, these county commissioners do everything. They're serious people. They're executives or whatever. And now they would argue, well, there's a few places that are right out of Cook County in the Metropolitan Water District. And we'd lose some really talented people. But if we did it right, some of those talented people would replace some of the county commissioners that ought to be gone anyway. So there's a lot we could do, you know. I'd even suggested way back, there's 4 major county offices dealing with taxes, okay? The clerk's office, we set the tax rates, we deal with tax delinquent property. The assessor assesses the property, the treasurer sends out the bills, and the recorder deals with property, whatever. Some people worry about centralized government, but I'm always looking for government where you can understand where the buck stops, who's responsible. So if I could wave the magic wand, I would combine all those real estate issues into a person in charge of real estate appointed by the president of the county board, okay? Therefore, the county board president, everybody knows, that's the person. And then you get away from this 4 different offices, all with their different technology. The good ones trying to work together, the bad ones trying to buy new technology and then get the campaign contributions back from the friends that they select. And all this confusion, you go downtown, well, wait a second, go to the assessor's office. No, go to the clerk's office, go to the treasurer's office. No, you go to the recorder's office, okay? So yes, the questioner is right. There's a lot we could do, but like many things, where do we do the organizing? Where do we get the help? There's been some good things, like I say, all the wings I mentioned, including movement on township government. So it's a good direction for the future because we won't be able to afford it.
Jeff, did you have a question? No? Does anyone else have a question? If you do, unmute yourself.
I have a question, Louise Rissman.
Could you identify
did you say
yourself?
we could-
Hello?
Louise
Could you say your name?
Rissman. Louise Rissman.
Thank you.
Me. Did you say we could listen into a tax meeting from Chicago next week? They're going to have on budgets or
Tax rates? I'm not sure if I got the
something.
question. Well,
It was the beginning of your talk.
it might be this. Historically, one of the functions of the county clerk, okay, is provide the tax rates for all of the hundreds of bodies, okay? Big ones like Chicago, small ones like the Dixmoor Park District. Every one of those, quote, governments has to have a levy, okay? And the first thing we do is set the tax rate. By the way, let me just tell you a story, kind of a mistake that really kind of hurt county government. Dick Phelan was president of the county board way back in 1990, okay? Pretty good guy. Some of you might remember he was president. He was also ambitious, so he ended up running for governor in 1994 and lost in the primary. So he was only a one-term county board president. But there's two different things. There's the tax rate and the tax levy, okay? And I think this was a mistake, okay? You can freeze the tax rate, as Richard Daley did. You freeze the rate, but the levy still gradually goes up as values go up. So in the city of Chicago, they might freeze the tax rate, but the amount of money available for governments continued to rise some, okay? But, excuse me, Dick Phelan, if I'm getting this wrong, but I think that there was kind of a mistake there that no one's had the guts to try and fix since 1994. And they froze the levy and not the rate. So if I remember my figures correctly, back in 1994, a long time ago, right, the county of Cook was getting about $720 million from property taxes every year. What are they getting today? About $720 million. And think of the differences. Think of salaries, other responsibilities, blah, blah, blah. So sometimes things can happen like that. But back to your point, the clerk, that's probably what's going on. Again, I'm no longer there, but the clerk sets the tax rates based on a very complicated formula. And that then determines the levies, okay? And that affects future taxes. One thing relating to that is that one of the most important things that we can change, I know we're getting away from the election, in my mind, is the old ways of doing taxes and other things in Chicago. That Fritz Kage's election for county assessor, I think, was extraordinarily important. You know, a lot of the old machine stuff, you know what a machine is all about. It's basically you get yours, I get mine, and the taxpayers get the bill. Okay, in a simplistic way, that's what it was all about. Okay, and so part of the reason Barrios lost is that he got his hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars from people that work with that industry. Okay, you know, often for deals that made their property go down, but made the rest of ours going up. Fritz Kage, I believe, is extraordinarily talented and sincere, and he's changing that. But he's not the only person involved in this. For example, he set all these rates for commercial, and I'll take an example. Look at Evanston. Evanston was reassessed, okay? And actually some of the commercial and business had to pay more, okay? Although they're looking at other things because of pandemic and so forth. But basically, there was many cases where you take, you know, a hotel that said they were only worth 30 million, but when they're trying to sell it, they were asking 60 million, all sorts of reasons to suggest they're not quite telling the truth. So Fritz Kage, as assessor, did his job and saved a lot of money in Evanston. And then the Board of Review, anybody know what the Board of Review is? Another one of these, why do we have so many units of government. It's a new thing created, I think, probably more for political reasons than anything else, created where there's 3 commissioners, what's called the Board of Review, and they do the same thing. You can appeal to them. And so they did different assessments. Now, with Fritz Kage, you know exactly the numbers they use and everything. The Board of Review, it's really not so clear. But the Board of Review cut a lot of those big businesses. And it might have, and I don't know all the information yet, it might have the effect of raising every citizen's income, property taxes in Evanston by between $500 and $1,000. So if you let major companies and businesses pay less than you should, somebody makes it up because the levy's still the same for Evanston. So there's a lot of things in government, and people get tired of me railing against the old machine. Basically, I'm railing against unaccountable government, of which there's plenty of it. And I would call this whole thing a cottage industry. There's decent lawyers, they have a job to do, but misused by political powerful folks like Barrios, number one, to help their friends and raise hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the political will of the old gang, okay? That is what we have to change to get fairer government and get government that spends more wisely than what we've had. I have a lot of examples like that, but.
One last question. Could you make some comments about the social unrest as it has to do with the election process?
Social unrest? You mean the violence associated with police accountability and stuff? Or the
Yes.
Well, it ultimately it all comes back to accountability. I'm saying the most important thing we need in accountability in government is accountability. You can't really have accountability if you have people representing 38 million people and they get 2 votes, and people representing 1 million people, they get 2 votes. I'm using those as kind of examples. Here, the case is the ultimate problem with police violence, okay, based on racism and inequality, is ultimately unaccountability. Now, of course, these are very complicated, and I know I'm not the expert here, but I would suggest the following. These things are extraordinarily difficult to change without accountability. Remember, the police, doesn't mean all the policemen, but the police were used for years and years. And let's go back to Richard J. Daley. Richard J. Daley was as racist as you get, if those of you were around at the time. Police knew their job was to stop African Americans from going to certain neighborhoods, to keep the schools segregated, to keep the neighborhoods segregated. Police would regularly stop people. Even in Rogers Park here, I get furious how police stop people who are black, who happen to be my neighbor, but they're stopped, not necessarily white kids. So the question is, knowing how much of that's in our history, and the violence we've seen on TV just kind of blows that up, and kind of like the spark that set off a lot of the civil rights movement, we had a spark, unfortunately, because of killing a citizen in Minneapolis. So the key is accountability. The reason people need to understand politics is because we lack that accountability in Chicago. Now, the Mayor Daley could have done a lot about it, but he didn't for the obvious reasons. He was enforcing a different cultural law, okay? Harold, if he lived, Harold Washington, I think could have done more. But people didn't do much more since that. So what happens is you have structures like, in this case, the police union, okay? I'm a union man, but I'm amazed at what the leadership of the FOP, what we call the Fraternal Order of Police, what this guy keeps talking about. I mean, it sounds like you can do no wrong. You can pull out a gun and shoot someone because you don't like the color of their hair. You know what I mean? So, and that's an extreme. But at some point, you have to understand, why does that happen? Okay, the more you dig, it's the lack of accountability. Okay, and unfortunately, I think to a great extent, again, Mayor Richard M. Daley and even Rahm gave away too much in the police contracts. there've been many cases where police would get fired and 4 or 5 years later, they're hired back. And that's because there's details in the police contract, okay? And those are the union people. We believe the contract, is law, but you need to take political to change it. Now, there's some very good signs. Recently, an administrative court, what do they call it? What's the word? But they were brought before it was a union issue, because remember, I'm sorry?
Arbitration?
Yes, thank you. An arbiter ruled, now this is for, remember, you've got separate union for captains, lieutenants, and sergeants, okay? What I'm getting at is, if you're a mayor that wants to do something, you don't have that much power. See what I mean? You've got your executives, but if the union has a great deal of influence because of the laws in the union contract, and the union has captains, sergeants, lieutenants, you can see if in fact you want to enforce an old way of doing policing, which I think is wrong, including don't tell and don't squeal and all that kind of crazy stuff. We see it over and over again. It's why we see so many things over I don't need to go into them. Even at Mayor Daley, I mean, when his relative killed that kid named Koshman, years later now, they're pointing out that they had relatives there that night with him that did not even speak up. And so years later, that comes out, and it's not even in Daniel Webb's report, the hotshot lawyer that's supposed to come to the bottom of things. So there's a reason why this stuff gets covered up, and why the Byrd stuff, that horrible police lieutenant who tortured so many people, there's reasons for it. So if I was to tell you what we need to change, fundamentally it's accountability. We have two major ways to do that in the coming months. One is a consent decree, okay? The mayor just put together a panel that's going to be involved in this consent decree with a lot of people who are pretty angry at her. So it's kind of shocking. And my guess is she put people on there who are very angry about the situation, because she knows the consent decree, they got to push really hard, because consent decrees can take forever. Just to go, you might remember, Georgia might, but I go way back to 1979 being elected. And within 2 months of being elected, because I was elected the same night as Jane Byrne finally signed a consent decree about housing, because for decades, and of course it didn't stop what I'm about to say, for decades, when it came to building public housing, affordable housing, et cetera, the city just ignored all those laws, because they were not going to let Black people move into the northwest side of Chicago, no matter what the law said. Richard J. Daley would just stick his nose at the feds, and he was too powerful in the 1960s to do anything about it. So Jane Byrne came in, the feds had lost a lot of money because Daley wouldn't do anything about it. So she signed the consent decree, and they started, I can't say they did a good job, but they started with some of the, what they call scattered site public housing. So consent decrees happen when clearly, in this case, over the years, Chicago and its police department were breaking the law, okay? So one, in terms of change, is the consent decree, and the other is the police contract. And the police contract needs to be fair to the police, to union members, they got certain rights and so forth, but there's way too many things which cause this notion that they can do whatever they want, okay? And we've seen too many cases, even the Eddie Johnson case. I mean, every case you talk about, top-ranking police officials clearly didn't tell the truth and got away with it. Didn't tell the truth, and if they got in real trouble, they just quit and took their $140,000 pension, okay? So that is going to be really, really tough. People don't understand how tough it's going to be, because the union doesn't like what the mayor is saying, and they don't. She wants more accountability. Then the result will be they can go to arbitration. So this is really, really difficult. If I had to besides the things we need to do to, work with community groups, even work with some of the gangbangers, there's so much we need to do, but above all, understand we have hurt people, we've underfunded programs, we've really done enormous harm over the years. Let's change that. That's why I started earlier saying the state should pay its fair share of schools. Boom, really big. There's so many other things we should do, but above all, we have to have accountability in the police department. A whole different approach to it would be the following. Part of the reason we might have someone elected as head of the police union, I don't know if you know this, and the new police union head has said some really outrageous things, looking for fights and so forth. Well, when it comes to electing head of the police union, retirees get to vote. There's probably a lot of good retirees, but remember, that means that there's thousands and thousands of police who are hired at a different age. One, they're mostly white, okay? And two, again, some of them were there for the reasons I mentioned. There's people that were cops there when Old Man Daley was around. And again, they may be very good people, but they were forced to play a racist cultural game all that time. And so they might have very different views, okay? That has to change. I would love to see cops of goodwill, and we do have cops of goodwill, Black, Latino, white, whatever they may be, okay? I'd like to see them stepping forward. Now they're afraid, okay? And they got a right to have a union, but they have a right to also say, we will not tolerate this kind of activity. Anybody that studied Laquan McDonald and all the cover up and delays. So back and I'll conclude here, that we're making steps in the right direction. Like the arbitrator's ruling said a couple things. Number one, it said, yes, we can have anonymous complaints. If you don't have anonymous complaints, people are gonna be afraid, right? They're gonna be afraid of filing a complaint. Now, police are worried, oh, well, any clown can say something about me. Alderman was always worried about the same thing, but the bottom line is that's gonna happen. When you've got the power to kill people, you need to have more accountability, even if you don't like some of the people who are gonna say bad things about you. Also, one of the key issues was the police don't get to find out who the accuser is immediately, okay? There's a lot of things about how one deals with alleged police brutality when it happens. And those are the things that they're trying to change in the union contract, okay? If they do, there'll be more accountability, but it's not an easy thing to do. Now, the good news is most of what the arbitrator did was based on what actually Mayor Lightfoot had said in 2016 when she was trying to reform that stuff, when she was actually heading up that agency for Rahm at that time because things were so desperate. So I don't even question the mayor knows what accountability is and wants it. The question is, how do we get there? It's kind of like, how do we pass health care that people want when 40 US senators can block it? Okay, it's a similar structural problem. And so we need lots of people making noise, demanding it. I mean, there's a lot of confusion around this battle, the whole defunding. So the final thing would be is to fight crime. I always have said for years, it's the long-term solutions that will work. Yeah, I'm forgetting guns off, but all those things, those are just these surface things. You can't have, if you studied the history of the city, which I fortunately have and do teach about it sometimes, you can't have an entire race of people who are denied access to what every other American, in most cases, how they got whatever wealth they have. Wealth might mean they have a home, okay? Just think of this. Almost every other American with a GI Bill of Rights, their main success was they were able to buy a home, and then maybe they built up some equity, and maybe they bought a nicer home, okay? If you study Chicago and other places, unfortunately, and you say in which the banks and all these other things denied that right to hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the city of Chicago, so they could never accumulate that wealth. And we say, oh, well, they don't want to work as hard as we do. Okay. And you could take those examples over and over again when they couldn't move into other neighborhoods. And if they did, their homes got bombed. You know these examples as much as I do. And it's not feeling sorry for ourselves, it's being honest with the advantages that are built into the system when people don't understand the incredible roles of racism and inequality. And so I'm all for kind of, we use the word Marshall Plan. We need a Marshall Plan for the cities. And frankly, under certain presidents, there's very little interest there. And no offense to Republicans, Republicans don't tend to represent the big cities, so they don't want the money going there. They tend to want the money going to suburban areas and further out. And that's been the case for a long time. But we have to be honest, and we need to do more than just demand accountability from the police. But whenever we're trying to make these changes, it's often a time when financially we're so strapped. At least when the civil rights movement came about, despite the terrible war in the 1960s, the economy was much stronger. Okay, we even had a quote war on poverty. And frankly, we're an extraordinarily rich country. Okay. And again, if we could just get those with so much money would pay their fair share of taxes, we'd be able to fight these battles more successfully. So I mean, that issue could go on. It's so complicated, but we need fundamental accountability of police and how they use weapons, violence, etc. But in the long term, we've got to understand the long-term solutions are the ones that'll work. And we need that now. And we need to be talking about it every day, even though I don't see a pot of gold coming from the federal government. I mean, whether it's the mayor encouraging wealthy people to contribute more as they're trying to do in some of these neighborhoods, we just got to get more resources into the schools, summer jobs, programs. And frankly, I'd be all for trying to deal with that wealth gap created by all the discrimination in housing. You know, we talk about, you know, giving a certain amount of money to people right now during the pandemic. I'd all be for that. I mean, it's like money flowing to people who've been discriminated against, and most of them are relatively poor. All that money goes back into the economy. It's not like going to some rich person that they don't spend it. And the economy gets better when money goes to folks that have to spend every dime on living. They don't have the option of putting it away. So
Amen to that.
Enough.
You mentioned earlier on about a meeting with Wagasback.
Yes.
Could you send a link to me on that as well? And some of our membership has expressed interest in that.
Sure. By the way, that's going to be next Tuesday night, the 14th at 7 o'clock at night. You know, we do our little virtual things too. And we're going to have Alderman Scott Wagasback, as you mentioned, and also Alderman Matt Martin, who's a new alderman from the 47th Ward, smart guy. And again, we can't cover everything, but we will do our best to try and raise some of these issues of how is a city going to grapple with the finances that were always at a big problem even before the pandemic. Okay, are we done?
Yes, I think so. Thank you very much. And thank you for a great presentation. We learned a lot.
Thank you.
So thank you one and all for attending. We're back again next month, first Tuesday of the month. You're all welcome back.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan. Hi, Dan.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.